It's tax time, and I know a lot of you are gathering all of your information and starting to look over your numbers for the last year. And I'm starting to get more questions about personal finance software and how to track expenses and that kind of thing. So I thought I would just do a video on that, do some suggestions for you high level, make some suggestions for you about what you might use in terms of just software, and then where you want to put your time and energy. I want to make two disclosures or disclaimers at the beginning of this video. One is that the majority of my client base does not track their expenses to the penny. Most of them create a spending plan or a budget, if you like that word better, by licking their finger, sticking it into the wind and go, okay, I paid all my bills. I saved the money I wanted to save. Everything's good. And they don't really worry about where money went. And that is a perfectly fine way to create a spending plan if it's working. That's how most of my clients do this. I will also tell you that for me personally, I've been tracking my expenses in a Quicken product for decades now, and I have a very difficult time separating from that. So I do actually track all my expenses. And I've seen the evolution of this over time and how complicated it's gotten. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But I just wanted to be very clear about that I actually do track all my expenses, and I do it mostly out of habit, and it just makes me feel good. And sometimes I catch mistakes, and sometimes I catch fraud, and sometimes it's super valuable. And it is definitely valuable around tax time because it allows me to grab big chunks of expenses that need to go into that little organizer that my tax preparer wants. So let's just talk high level for a second. When you're keeping track of your expenses, in my mind, you're doing it for three primary reasons. Number one, to identify fraud. Number two, to identify expenses that have gone up that you didn't expect, or to see expenses that you're paying, particularly subscription services these days that you no longer want to keep. It's a great way to identify those. And then the third thing is to separate out what I would call short-term or one-time expenses. I think that's actually a really valuable exercise in keeping track of your expenses as well. And I'll talk about that in just a minute about what I mean by that. Like I said, I've been tracking my expenses in QuickBooks for a really long time. I probably pay too much for it. I don't even really like the service that much. My clients used to really love Mint.com until Quicken bought it and kind of ruined it. And these are the ones that I hear about the most now. So Rocket Money is one I hear about, Pocket Guard I hear about, and YNAB. You need a budget, YNAB, YNAB. And so those are the ones that I just hear about the most. I cannot tell you whether one is better than the other. You will have to go investigate on your own, but you can purchase those particular softwares. Your banking system actually will also keep track of your expenses and send you a report at the end of the year. I find it particularly lacking if you want to get granular about it in any way, but it is another way to do this, and it kind of happens automatically. If you log into your banking systems, you'll see it. And then my clients have the ability to go into their financial planning software portal, and then they can also track their expenses there. What I want to warn you about in using any of these particular services, whether you're paying for them or not, is that you're going to have to spend some time training it to understand how you spend money and how you want this information sorted. And you're going to have to spend some time then forcing some things that were miscategorized so that you can get reports in the way that you want to see them. So it is going to take some time and investment. I think for those of us who really like to keep track of expenses, it's valuable and worth doing, but it's certainly not required. Like I said, finger stick it in the wind. That often works for most of my clients. So what I want to talk about is a couple particular items that seem to hang up clients the most. And the first one is what I'll call the Amazon Target purchase. So what's gotten difficult about keeping track of expenses now is that you get on Amazon or you walk into Target or Costco and you might buy household goods, you might buy groceries, and you might buy clothes all in the same purchase. And in the past, I've always separated those things out. I want to see what I'm spending on clothes. I want to see what I'm spending on groceries. I want to see what I'm spending on household supplies. So you can still do that. You can go down and dig into your receipt and sort it all out on your system. I personally no longer do that. What I will do instead is if I want to keep track of, let's say, clothes, I will just make sure that I make a purchase for clothes and then everything else goes on another purchase so that I can sort it out at the end of the month as to how I want to categorize that. But most of the time, what I will do is I will just create now a category that's called everyday expenses. And so I might not have now a very accurate picture of what I've spent on groceries, but I do have an idea of what I'm spending on everyday expenses that are what I think are going to be repeated year in and year out. Okay, so I'm capturing still what's going on in my spending, but it's just gotten less granular, but that has actually worked for me. If it doesn't work for you, it's going to take you some time to sort all of this out, tax on the Amazon receipt and all of that, but it can be done. I've had clients do it, and they've actually, if they just do it for a year, even a quarter of the year, it's often very enlightening for them about how they're spending their money. So that's worth doing. So that's how I handle that Amazon, Target, multiple categories in the same purchase and how I handle that. There are certain things that I think from a financial planning standpoint that are worthwhile also to separate out. And the big ones that come up for me are what I call one-time expenses or short-term expenses. So by one-time expenses, I mean things like we're doing a home remodel. We're having somebody in the family is having medical work done, and that's going to be really expensive this year, but we're not going to be repeating that year in and year out. I will actually separate those out in my software so that I can see that, okay, yeah, I have regular medical expenses that might happen year in and year out, but this particular year I've got a big expenditure on medical expenses, and I will separate that out. And the reason that I do that is that way, if I want to take a look at, okay, how much money am I spending year in and year out, I can make some decisions about whether or not I want to count that one-time expense. The short-term expenses that I'm talking about are really what comes to mind for me is kids. Your kids, knock on wood, are not going to live with you forever, and they will at some point go off and have jobs and live their lives. And so there is a big expense that you are having now that you are not going to have once they leave. Again, knock on wood. I would do the same thing with their college tuition. Like I'd put that in a separate category as well. That way, as you are trying to plan for what your life is going to look like when you have left work for a paycheck and the kids are no longer at home, you have some sense of how much money you're spending. I think that is actually a really valuable piece of information to have as well and worth tracking. But you need to separate out some of those things because you know they're not going to follow you around forever. That's a big one. So the other thing that I think is worth tracking, and I sort of alluded to this before, is things like how much money you're spending on your cell phone so you can throw utilities and all of that, and subscription services. Like I think it is valuable to keep track of that, to see how much you're spending and on what, and whether or not you're really still using those subscription services or whether or not you want to get rid of them. And there's apps out there that will help you sort that out as well. But I do think that these are the benefits to actually keeping track of your expenses and getting a little bit more granular to the point that you can without making yourself crazy. It's not worth it to make yourself crazy, so don't do that. But to identify fraud, identify expenses that might be going up and what you might want to do about that, and then to separate out things that are just not going to last your whole lives, I think that is really valuable as well. And it's going to take some doing. And over the decades now that I've been keeping track of my expenses, I've just had to make mid-flight corrections in how I do my categorization because life has just changed. Amazon wasn't really a thing 20 years ago. It's now a thing. And yes, I make multiple category purchases when I'm there, just like everybody else does. At the end of the day, though, I can look from year to year to year and see how much I'm spending and where it's gone up and where it's gone down. And that actually has been very valuable as well. And I find that that's valuable also for my clients. So when it comes down to how are you tracking expenses and what are you spending your money on and that kind of thing, I do recommend keeping track of it, even if quite generally, sticking your finger and stick it in the wind still does work. But if you are going to keep track of expenses, then I highly recommend that you do it in a way that it actually is going to benefit you so that when you are sitting down to what is going to feel like very often a very tedious task, you've got some greater why or some greater goal in mind. It always helps me to get that done in those moments. If you have any questions, you're welcome to reach out. I'm Jessica Lanning. Lanning Does Planning.